Imagine it, a girl born from the burning desire of a king who defied an entire church, the Christian world, and the dictates of the Pope just to obtain a male heir. But fate gave him a daughter, an intelligent, cultured, observant girl. Her name was Maria, and her life, from her first cry to her last breath, would be a downward spiral of betrayal, fear, abandonment and illness. She wouldn't just be a queen, she would be a living warning of the price of having power as a woman. Today we're going to dive into the almost unreal tragedy of Mary Plea of England, also known as Bloody Mary. But what few know is that beyond the cruel nickname and the tales of burning at the stake, there was a broken woman consumed by hatred, remorse, and an illness so horrific that her body began to decompose before she died. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, do you believe power can literally destroy a person? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like if you want more stories like this. And now let's go back to the beginning of this real nightmare. Mary Tudor was born in 1516, daughter of Henry Hector and Catherine of Aragon. From a young age, she was treated like a princess, but also like a political tool. She learned Latin, Greek, music, and astronomy. She was without a doubt one of the most educated women of her time. But everything changed when her father became obsessed with obtaining a male heir. When he failed to achieve this with Catherine, he repudiated her, and with it also repudiated his daughter. Mary's childhood ended abruptly. She was declared illegitimate. Her mother was banished. She was stripped of her title, her security, her world. She went from being Princess Mary to simply Lady Mary. The royal disdain wasn't symbolic. It was tangible, humiliating, painful. Henry married Anne Boleyn, and Mary was forced to accept that she had no rights, that the king's new daughter Elizabeth was the legitimate heir, that it wasn't just a public humiliation, it was an emotional execution. The silence in the palace, the closed doors, the servants who no longer looked her in the eye, everything screamed, "You no longer matter." But she resisted, clinging fanatically to her Catholic faith and to the figure of her mother. It wasn't a strategy. It was a desperate cry to keep something intact inside her, because outside everything was falling apart. Time continued to advance, relentless. Henry married several more times. Anne Boleyn was executed. Elizabeth was also. Delegitimized for a time, and the court became an emotional, religious and political minefield. Mary, now an adult, still had no rights, no power, no allies. She had only one thing: faith. That faith that would ironically be both her salvation and her damnation. When her half-brother Edward VI ascended the throne after Henry's death, things didn't improve. Edward was a Protestant determined to erase all traces of Catholicism in England, and Mary was a stubborn stain, a living reminder of the old religion. She was forbidden to celebrate Mass. She was watched, suspected, isolated, and then the unthinkable happened. Edward died young in 1553. The power vacuum was exploited by a Protestant faction that attempted to impose Lady Jane Grey, a puppet queen of barely 16 years old. But the people elected Mary. Surprisingly, the woman marginalised for decades, the illegitimate daughter, was acclaimed by the common people, not out of affection, but out of hope. They hoped for order, stability, and above all, a return to the Catholic faith. Mary, at 37 years old, mounted a horse like an ancient warrior. She marched to London and took the crown. Her entry was triumphant, but beneath that crimson cloak, beneath a shining crown, lay an exhausted, swollen, fragile body and a wounded soul, obsessed with duty and punishment. From day one as queen, Mary faced the same dilemma that had devastated her father: the succession. Her age made her aware that she must marry and bear an heir, but her decision was political, not emotional. She elected Philip II of Spain, the son of Emperor Charles the Hussarn. The English people trembled. They did not want to be ruled by a foreigner. They feared being drawn into the Habsburg Wars. Parliament resisted. The nobility conspired. There were revolts. But Mary refused. She was convinced that her duty was to restore Catholicism, and that to do so, she must seal the most powerful alliance in Europe, that of Spain. So, in 1554 she married Philip and shortly afterward announced that she was pregnant. The bells rang out, the people celebrated. Finally, a Catholic dynasty was about to be born. But time passed and there was no birth. Her belly grew, her breasts swelled, she felt the symptoms of pregnancy, but there was no child, no movement, no signs of life, and the doctors didn't know what to say. The people began to murmur. It was all a farce. The supposed pregnancy lasted more than 11 months, and then, just as it came, it vanished. Mary disappeared from public view, became a recluse, and began to crumble not only physically but mentally. The Queen's body. She began to show alarming signs: abdominal pain, swelling, fever and discharge. Her body odour became fetid. Her skin changed colour, she fainted frequently, and she vomited bile. Helpless doctors began to fear the worst. Mary, meanwhile, clung to the idea that God was testing her, but her decisions became increasingly radical, and so began one of the darkest chapters in English history. For Mary, the failure of her pregnancy was not a sign, medical, but divine. In her vision, God was punishing her for not being firm enough. It wasn't enough to rule like a queen. She had to rule like a heavenly envoy, and to achieve this, she had to purge England of all heresy. Thus, the fire became policy and the flames became doctrine. The Queen, who had been received with applause, was now beginning to be feared. Between 155 and 1558, more than 280 people were burned alive for refusing to renounce their Protestant beliefs. Women, the elderly, and even young people. They weren't military enemies, they were citizens. Many of them were poor, ordinary people. Some could barely read, but they stood up for their beliefs, and that's why they burned. The smell of burning bodies mingled with Latin prayers and the screams of relatives. Maria didn't attend the executions, but she was aware of every name, every trial, every burning bonfire. She didn't feel cruelty, but duty. For her, those deaths were necessary to save souls, to cleanse her kingdom, to restore divine order. But the people began to call her Bloody Mary, not just because of the executions, but because of what her body was beginning to do. The court doctors watched in silence. Mary suffered from persistent internal inflammation. Her stomach hardened by moments and then collapsed like a balloon without air. Her breath was heavy, sour as if her insides were fermenting. The Queen would spend hours locked up without receiving anyone. Sometimes she didn't leave her chamber for days. Her face paled, her lips dried, and her skin began to change. First, a greyish hue on her hands, then purplish spots on her arms and legs, and finally a dark discharge from her abdomen. Philip, her husband, noticed the deterioration, but his presence in England was minimal. After the failed pregnancy, he returned to his affairs in Spain, leaving Mary alone. And that loneliness was like a fog that began to envelop everything. The court, the church, the very heart of the Queen. Isolated, Mary intensified her repression. Each letter spoke of God's duty, of necessary punishment. There was no room for love or doubt, but inside her body was a battlefield. She bled frequently. She had bouts of sudden fever and something else disturbing. She began talking to people who weren't present, men murmuring. She apologized to her mother and sometimes to her father. The doctors, under strict confidentiality, began to note unusual symptoms. They put the gums, unbearable pain in the lower abdomen, extreme halitosis, and a suspicion that no one dared to confirm. Internal gangrene. Gangrene in the 15th century was a death sentence. When an organ begins to rot from within, the body tries to eliminate it, but without antibiotics or modern surgery. The poison spreads, and that would explain the dizziness, the constant vomiting, the nauseating odour, and the greenish colour that her skin began to take on at certain times. But there was still hope. In 1557, Mary announced again that she was pregnant. Her belly grew again. Preparations were made for the birth. Even a wet nurse was appointed. This time everyone was more cautious, but the excitement was short-lived. The belly deflated. There was no child, no birth, only a thick silence in the palace. No one dared to look the Queen in the eyes. No one said the word everyone was thinking: hysteria, or worse, a tumour. The second false pregnancy was the final blow to her public image. The crowds no longer came out to see her. Parliament began to mutter about the succession, and Elizabeth herself, her half-sister, began to be seen as the inevitable alternative. Mary knew she would have no more children, and that truth devastated her. The Queen, in her desperation, decided to hand over the port of Calais, the last English bastion in France, to Philip. It was a national humiliation, a symbol of defeat, a deep wound to English pride. But for Mary, it was an act of love. an attempt to win back the attention of her absent husband. And yet, thus, Philip did not return. Night fell upon his kingdom, a night without dawn, and Mary, like her body, also began to rot in her soul. She no longer left the palace, she covered herself with heavy cloaks. She used intense perfumes that could not hide the smell of her sick body. Her hair, which had been reddish like her mother's, began to fall out in clumps. Her skin became translucent, covered with small ulcers that the doctors tried to cover with herbal ointments. It was said at court that her blood was no longer blood, that it was a dark, thick, almost black liquid, that her belly was swollen like a rotting pumpkin. Some servants claimed to hear her crying at night. Others swore that she spoke aloud to the baby Jesus, begging for forgiveness. But it wasn't over yet. The final act was still to come. The slow, painful, undignified death of a queen who believed she had God on her side and had only her faith as a shield against the rotting of her body and the abandonment of the world. And while the doctors, as they began to prepare the bed for an imminent agony, the eyes of the kingdom were already focused on another figure, Elizabeth. The shadow of her sister grew longer, and Mary faded. The rooms of Stan James's palace were transformed into silent crypts. The Queen lived wrapped in darkness. The curtains remained closed, the mirrors covered with dark cloths. The sound of her footsteps, once firm and ceremonial, was reduced to a faint shuffle. Mary no longer walked. She glided like a spectre. They saw her, and they were few. They noticed the transformation. Her back was bent, her fingers swollen, her nails bruised. The gangrene had advanced. Her belly continued to grow, but not with a child, but with a mass of decomposing flesh. Some doctors no longer concealed their judgment. A uterine tumour, probably malignant, perhaps cancer of the uterus or ovaries, a fatal sentence in the 10th century. The fever was constant, the convulsions frequent. Maria's breath polluted the air, a mixture of bile, putrefaction and blood. It was said that even her tears smelled bad, as if every fluid emanating from her body bore the mark of living decomposition. The stench forced the servants to air the corridors, burn incense, and place containers of vinegar in every corner. But nothing was enough. The Queen, in essence, was already dead. Only her heart, proud, indomitable, stubborn, refused to stop. The court was tense. No one knew what to do. No one dared to utter aloud what... It was obvious. Mary was dying. And meanwhile Elizabeth, the Protestant sister, the young woman who had been watched, interrogated, humiliated, was now greeted in the corridors with a new deference. The same nobles who had previously knelt before Mary were now beginning to bow their heads to Elizabeth behind her back, but ever closer. And Mary knew it, felt it in the air, in the murmurs that died away when she entered, in the letters that disappeared from her desk, in the faces that avoided her. "Look at her!" Power trickled through her fingers like the blood that stained her sheets. At night she spoke to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, as if she were still there. She spoke phrases aloud. "I have failed, mother. I did not save your legacy." Sometimes she muttered names of martyrs who had burned at her command and begged their forgiveness. At other times she raved, claiming that she could still conceive the child Jesus would bear her an heir if she showed enough faith. But her ugly face was a wreck. The doctors, they tried every remedy of the time. Bleeding mercury potions, resin poultices, none worked. One of them, desperate, applied an ointment made with animal fat and vinegar to the swollen belly. Upon contact, Maria's skin broke out in sores and oozed a foul-smelling black liquid that contaminated the room for days, yet she still didn't die. It was as if her soul clung to her ruined body, as if her mission, despite the abandonment, the failure, the illness, hadn't been accomplished. She refused to abdicate. She refused to surrender until the last moment. She wanted to govern, command, write, decide. But she no longer had a voice, nor steady hands, nor clear mind. The royal council began to act on its own. They consulted Elizabeth, prepared documents, appointed officials without informing Mary. Decisions were sealed in her name, but without her consent she, the Queen, was already an empty figure, a shadow, a corpse in office. History, however, is unforgiving, especially not when power is in decline. The people who had once acclaimed her now despised her. The streets murmured cruel jokes about her rotten belly. Songs were sung portraying her as an infertile witch possessed by demons. Maria's nickname, the Bloodthirsty One, was no longer just for the bonfires, it was now also for the purple colour of her dying skin. One morning, one of the younger doctors, secretly brought from Scotland, asked to examine her privately. When he entered her room, the silence was absolute. Maria was asleep. Her face was covered with a damp cloth. The doctor approached, trembling, and lifted the cloth. The sight had haunted him for years. The Queen's skin was torn in several places. There were greenish spots on her neck, open ulcers on her arms, and an acidic smell that made him vomit. Her stomach moved with involuntary muscle spasms, as if trying to expel something it couldn't. But the worst thing was seeing her half-open eyes, dry, tearless, lightless, staring into space. Outside Isabella she kept it, not out of love for her sister, but because of the inescapable call of fate. She would be the new queen, and with her accession would come the end of old Catholic England, the end of the stake, the end of Mary, but not yet. Mary, in a final gesture of resistance, asked to receive the last rites. The extreme unction was given in the middle of the stench, between candles blown out by the wind and a silver crucifix blackening in her hands. She could barely speak, but managed to utter one sentence: "May God receive me and forgive me." Her confessor, moved, later said he had never seen a soul so desperate for redemption. The bed was covered with white sheets, the walls were filled with religious images, and the silence was absolute. Death was already there, in every corner, in every shadow, but the last breath was still missing, the one that would put an end to a reign of blood, fire, and indescribable physical pain. And then, on a grey morning, as autumn tinged the palace gardens with copper, Maria's body gave a final spasm. That final spasm was brief, almost imperceptible, a faint creaking in the Queen's bones, a sigh caught in her chest. Her fingers clutched the silver crucifix, as if trying not to let go of the faith that had accompanied her to the threshold of the grave. And then, nothing. Queen Mary Tudor, first of her name, daughter of Catherine of Aragon and Henry, expired on the morning of November the 17th, 1558. At that instant, there was total silence. There were no bells, no crying. The stench emanating from her body already, putrefied, swollen, purplish. He seemed the last witness to a life of pain, fanaticism, and isolation. The palace did not announce his death immediately. The atmosphere needed to be prepared. Doors were sealed, messengers were sent secretly, and funeral protocols began to be drawn up. But within the stone walls, relief was felt. A whisper spread like wildfire. The Queen is dead. The Bloodthirsty One is dead. Elizabeth, her half-sister, received the news with calculated calm. She was in Hatfield. When a messenger approached her, they say that upon hearing the words, Elizabeth looked up to heaven, fell to her knees on the frozen grass, and murmured in Latin, "This is the Lord's work, and it is wonderful in our eyes." But behind the bow was a suppressed smile. The throne was finally hers. Meanwhile, Mary's body began its final decomposition. The doctors ordered her embalmed, but when they opened the corpse, the spectacle was grotesque. The belly was filled with dark pus and clotted blood. The viscera, they looked burned, the internal tissues in an advanced state of putrefaction. No one could explain how she had lived so many months in such a state of deterioration. The uterus, swollen and rotten, ruptured when they tried to extract it. It was as if the body had rotted from within for months, without completely yielding to death. Her face, deformed by suffering, was covered with perfumed cloths. Her eyes were closed, but they failed to erase the expression of horror that had been imprinted on her features. It was the face of someone who had seen the abyss. Outside, London was quietly celebrating. Protestant churches were filled with prayers. Some Catholics wept silently, aware that their time was over. But for the majority, relief reigned. The woman who had lit the bonfires, who had brought the kingdom back to Rome, who had wanted to produce an heir through blood and miracles, no longer existed. The funeral was arranged quickly. The coffin was sealed tightly. It was feared that the stench would cause nausea in the procession. The mourners used handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar. The coffin, covered with black velvet and bearing the royal coat of arms, was carried through the streets to Westminster Abbey. But unlike other royal funerals, the crowd did not weep. They did not throw flowers. They did not pray devoutly. Many attended out of obligation, not regret. The throne, meanwhile, changed hands. Elizabeth was proclaimed queen with impeccable solemnity. Her entry into London was a jubilant procession. People shouted her name. The streets filled with torches, colours and hymns. A new era had begun, an era without bonfires, an era without ulcers and phantom fetuses, an era of youth, cunning and renewed power. Elizabeth's reign would be long, brilliant and feared, but her rise was marked by the image of her sister, a woman destroyed by religion, duty and her own body. In the shadows of the new palace, people still talked about the dead queen. Some servants swore they heard slow footsteps and wailing at night. In the corridors, they said Mary's soul had found no rest, and perhaps it hadn't. Her legacy, no doubt, was contradictory. Her half-sister Elizabeth ascended the throne, and with her came the propaganda that cemented Mary's dark legacy. The image of Mary as a bloodthirsty, insane and fanatical queen was carefully crafted by her Protestant enemies. Elizabeth's reign, known as the Golden Age, needed a dark mirror, and Mary was the perfect scapegoat. The executions of Protestants, though brutal, were not very different from what other monarchs did at the time, but in her case they were exaggerated, repeated and immortalised in books like Fox's Book of Martyrs. Thus the legend of Bloody Mary was born, the cruel queen who delighted in fire and pain. Mary's story did not end with her death. Her name became a curse, her figure an omen. In popular culture she transformed into a ghost, a spirit invoked in mirrors, a symbol of feminine terror. The tragedy is that behind this monstrous figure was a deeply human woman, a daughter abandoned by her father, a wife unloved by her husband, a queen destroyed by illness, and a woman consumed by the weight of power in a world that never forgave her for being born a woman. Mary Tudor's life is the perfect example of how history can be cruel, how a person's suffering can be twisted into legend. She was a queen, yes. She was also a persecutor, yes. But above all, she was a victim of her time, of her family, of her body, and of the merciless disease that rotted her from within. So next time you hear the name Bloody Mary, remember that behind the myth lies a broken woman, who only wanted to love, to be loved, and to leave an heir who would secure her place in history. Instead, her body betrayed her, and her enemies immortalised her as a monster. And perhaps the real horror is not that she was Bloody Mary, but that history never allowed her to be simply Mary.